Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav etzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in the words of Torah. All right, so tonight we are jumping into the chapters 4 and 5 of Ezekiel. Now this is, if you can, I think everybody can see the shared screen. This will be our getting into the actual pronouncements that that Ezekiel is going to be giving to the people. You know, the first 3 chapters were the vision and then his calling, and then we did all of that, and then now this week we finished off with Ezekiel basically being silenced. God told him, go home and be quiet. You're not going to be able to say anything. And so then we get into chapter 4. And as you see chapter 4 begin, you'll see that Ezekiel is told to go out and do some things. Okay. And it's going to be, it's kind of funny because it's going to be kind of like a pantomime, or a maybe not a pantomime, but it's going to be where he acts things out. So let's go ahead and read those first few verses. Now, you son of man, take a brick and lay it before you. Engrave on it a city, Jerusalem. Lay siege against it, build earthworks against it, raise an assault ramp against it, pitch camps against it, and place battering rams all around it. Then take an iron plate and set it up as an iron wall between you and the city. Set your face toward it so that it is under siege. So you will lay siege against it. This will be a sign to the house of Israel. All right, so this is a pantomime. This is Ezekiel had basically been shut up. God said, you're not going to be able to speak to the people about everything that I want them to do. And so here he was. Now, last week we had talked about whether, okay, was this a real physical thing that he could not speak, or was this something that God just told him, don't say a word? And so we don't really know. But at one point, it just seems like that here, as we begin this class, that in this chapter, that okay, he's still not speaking. It's because in 3:26, chapter 3 and verse 26, God had shut his mouth. So these prophecies are not really spoken, but they're acted out, kind of like, I would guess, a street mime or something like that, where they do things and you try to guess. It's almost like a game of charades in a way, I guess it would be, where he's trying to get a message out, and you don't really know how much the people understood it. But looking at, he's got this great big brick, and he scratches a map of Jerusalem on the top of the brick, and then he sets up stuff all around it, kind of like little boys will do with their army things. Any of you guys that were guys, and you know what I'm talking about, when we were little, we had these little plastic things, the soldiers with one, that they got their gun, another one is shouting, let's charge, and another one, this all different kinds of shapes that these soldiers were in, and they had tanks, and they, all of that different kind of stuff. You'd set all that stuff up, and so it looks like that's kind of what he is doing here. And the iron plate possibly was, a plate from either an oven or just where they cook things out over an open fire, and he's supposed to set that up between him and this little model that he's made up. And then says that this will be a sign to the house of Israel. Now, Israel had already fallen. Remember, this is taking place about 590, something like that, because it's 586 then BCE when Jerusalem falls to Babylon. But this was before that, so this would be 591, 592, something like that. And because he had been taken in I think 597, and he had been over there for about 5 years. And Ezekiel is like 30 years old now. And so when they say Israel, and you can take it that we're talking about Israel and Judah, it's the same thing, because a lot of times when God is talking about one or the other, the northern tribes or southern tribes, he'll say, and this is for Israel, and also for you, Jacob, and which meaning Judah and so forth. So I think we can take all this to mean the people there in Jerusalem and around Judah, because that was the area that Babylon was assaulting at the time, and that's where that's where Ezekiel was when he was taken from Jerusalem, and along with Daniel and his friends and so forth. So this iron plate, it could be several things. Several commentators had different ideas about what it could be. Some said that, okay, this is shows that there's an impenetrable barrier between the Israel and the Babylonians, in that there's no escaping from them. They can't get out of the city at all, because that iron plate, that would be running up against that iron plate. And other people said that, well, maybe this barrier here would signify the wall between God and the people of Jerusalem. So I don't really, I'm looking at probably I'd have to come down on the side of that it was a barrier to set up, it's a barrier between Israel and the Babylonians, where they were not going to, the Israelites were not, the Judeans, people from Jerusalem, would not be able to escape from the siege of Babylon. So, and then it says you're to lie on your left side, and set on it the punishment of the house of Israel according to the number of days that you lie on it. You will bear their iniquity. I have appointed the years of their punishment to you as a number of days, 390 days. So you will bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. All right. So Ezekiel, here's a picture, okay, that someone had painted of, you see here's the brick with Israel, Jerusalem etched in the top of it. And then all around it, he's got these, I guess that would be the siege engines or whatever, because you got a ramp here with a battering ram, and these little stones, maybe they represent the cohorts of soldiers, and out here the camp of soldiers and so forth. So it's kind of hard to figure out what he was doing here and saying, but anyway, that's what God had told him to do. He was to recline in public on his left side for 390 days. Now, this was to represent the number of years that Israel would have to bear punishment for their sins, maybe. And so when Ezekiel laid on his left side, he faced north, the northern kingdom, and this has meant that his body would have been pointing west toward Jerusalem. Now, another interpretation is that the house of Israel refers both to northern and southern kingdoms, like I talked before, and that the 390 days represents the whole history of Israel sinning. All right, so we don't really know. There's a couple of interpretations of this. I looked, depends on who you're asking. And I read, I don't know how many commentaries on it as to what they thought. 390 days would corresponding to years. That would have been roughly the time frame from from Solomon's temple time when Solomon died and the kingdom was split to the present. And we know that all during that time, even during Solomon, I mean, Solomon was he's supposed to be the wisest guy in the whole world, and yet he had 1,000 wives, and he allowed their gods, their religion to permeate Jerusalem and so forth. So those I don't know. It's that could very well be from where it started, the 390 years. And then other people said, no, this is 390 years from this point forward that Israel was going to be punished and disciplined for 390 years going into the future. Well, and if you look at that aspect of it, it would kind of run you up to roughly the time when the Maccabees started their war against the Seleucid Greeks and Antiochus Epiphanes, and that would have been okay. They're under punishment, under domination, and all that until that period of time, and then they had thrown off the yoke of bondage. So there is that. We really don't know which one it is that they're talking about, but I kind of, I can see both sides of it as far as whether that would mean the going backwards, that just being punished for all those years of messing up, or that, okay, yeah, you got all those years messing up, now you're going to pay for it, and you're going to go to, you're going to be in bondage for the next 390 years because you've already messed up for 390 years. So I don't know. Anybody got any comments on that? You may have a different interpretation of it. Go ahead,
I was always taught that it was over those 390 years were the number of Shemitah or sabbatical years that they did not let the land lay fallow, and so now they were paying for it. And then Judah, it was 40 years since Josiah, was the same thing. Those over that 40 years, they didn't take give the land their due rest, or have people return to their
Right.
So at any rate, that's the way I always was taught on it.
Except then that I thought it was the idea of the Shemitahs that they did not observe was like 70 of them. So 70 times 7 would be 490 years. I don't know. I'd have to go back and revisit that. But I know that that's what their captivity was, that they would be in captivity for 70 years because they had failed to observe 70 Shemitah years. Okay. And so they're that's one that part of it I do know that the because God said, okay, you're going to be under bondage for 70 years. The land will be empty for 70 years because the land is going to have its rest. You never gave the land its rest. It's going to have its rest now. And so we do know that. Like I said, the 390 days, and we'll get into a little bit more, maybe another explanation or so in just a minute as we go into the next scriptures. Okay, and it says, when you have completed these, the 390 days, you will lie on your right side and bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days, a day for each year I have appointed to you. So he says, you'll set your face toward the siege of Jerusalem with your arm bared, prophesy against it. Behold, I will put ropes on you, and you will not be able to turn from side to side until you have completed the days of your siege. Now, after the 390 days had expired, he was supposed to lie on his right side then for 40 days, and this was to represent the number of additional years that the southern kingdom of Judah would have to suffer punishment for his sin. He was to face Jerusalem with his arm bared, signifying that God's hostility toward his people. And another view of that, and again, you just go in and find you a commentator, and you'll get a different or pick up a different book, and you might get a different answer. Another view is that the 40 days represented the time of suffering that the remnant in captivity would experience, corresponding to the 40 years of punishment that the generation of Israelites that left Egypt in the Exodus experienced in the wilderness. I think that one is maybe kind of a stretch, but the two alternative interpretations, again, you've got that 40, and you add the two up, 390 and 40, and so that comes up to 430 years, and that's where, like I said, you could get up to toward where the Maccabean War would be. Also, 430 years was what the Israelites were in Egypt for, that length of time. So there's all sorts of symbolism here that I'm not really sure we've got a good handle on what they mean exactly, and that's the danger that you have of studying Ezekiel or Daniel or Revelation, that sometimes we just don't know what the symbolism is. In our modern Western world, it may have been very obvious to the people back in those days in the ancient Near East, but not so much for us. So I don't know. That's you can take the numbers as being symbolic rather than literal, but I'd normally shy away from if what the Bible says is what it says, and then unless you have a very good reason to jump out of that and to make it something else, then you stay with exactly the literal, what did the Bible say in black and white, the Peshat look at of reading, rather than going into the Remez or Drash or Sod. And so those of you that don't know, that is a Jewish way of interpreting scriptures, meaning the black and white, or maybe a hint of something else, or maybe a deeper study being the Drash, or the Sod meaning the spiritual, more of an esoteric, spiritual, mystical view of studying the Bible. So I very, very seldom ever get away from the Peshat, because I think that's the safer way to do it, is to stay right there, unless someone else in the Bible interprets it a little bit and says, okay, and this is what that means. Yeshua did that a good bit. It's a scripture, and he said, well, this is what the intent was. So the prophesying that Ezekiel was doing was against Jerusalem itself, and that's what this whole skit that he's doing is against. Now, the Septuagint, in their translation, they had Ezekiel lying on his left side for 190 days and on his right side for 150 days, but they don't give any kind of a reason for that. There is none. But if you go back to the original Hebrew, it was 390 and 40. So all of these days that represented years of divine punishment, that they seem very clear. But what what is not clear is, okay, are we talking literal years, figurative years? Were they in the past or were they in the future? If they're in the future, then did it begin at the year of Jehoiakim's deportation? That would have been 597 BCE, and that's the date that Ezekiel dates all of his stuff from, was that time when they were taken into captivity. And so if you do that, then the 430 years would have ended at 167 BC. This is the first year of the Maccabean revolution, or rebellion, when they threw off Antiochus Epiphanes. So yeah, there's a couple of ways, and I think it's just a mystery. Somebody smarter than me would have to come up with an answer for that. And there's another thing that 430 days may have been the total length of the siege of Jerusalem, which God used, he viewed as a punishment. Then 40 more years of the southern kingdom's sins, the 390 for Israel, and then 40 more for southern kingdom of Judah, because you remember, none of the northern kingdom kings were godly men. Okay, none of them. And yet in the southern kingdom of Judah, they had several, not many, but they had several who were godly men and who had long reigns of godliness, and they brought the people back to where they should be, or at least closer to God than out and out idolatry and so forth. So either way, these years, and there again, I don't know how Ezekiel even portrayed these years, 390 years. I mean, so he's sitting out there for 390 days. It's over a year that he's laying there on his left side at a specific time of the day. I'm sure that he didn't lay on his left side 24/7 every day for 390 years. That would be almost impossible to do. And we know that, when people say that they fasted for 40 days, it was a daylight. Generally speaking, we're talking about a daylight fast from sunrise to sunset would be the days, a day. That would be a normal daylight fast. We do that for Tisha B'Av and the fast of Gedalia, the fast of Esther, and those kind of minor fasts throughout the year. Those are daylight fasts, and not a full 24-hour fast like would be Yom Kippur. Okay. And so like I said also, that another view is that this 430 years symbolizes Israel's captivity in Egypt, and Hosea had warned the Israelites that God would return them to Egypt, in quotation marks, or in, as a kind of analogy, or as a hint as to where they would be, not really Egypt, but a foreign country, for further punishment. And if the people did not repent. So the 490 years could represent the greater sinfulness of the northern kingdom, and somebody else said, well, the 40 was intended to remind Ezekiel's audience of the 40 days of rain during the flood. Maybe are the 40 years of Moses' sojourn in where Moses was in Midian, or the 40 years of Israel's wandering in the wilderness. All of these were kind of periods of judgment. So we don't know. It's just it's not cleared up for us what those are. So another view said that the 430 years represented the years of the monarchy, or the years that Solomon's temple stood. And so it still remains very difficult to explain exactly what God had in mind for that, because Ezekiel was doing a pantomime, and it wasn't really explained to us very well. Okay, so and then down there on the binding, that there again, the binding is not really spelled out to us as to what it meant for the binding of Ezekiel, other than, he was not to turn away from his appointed task there. And I don't even know how the binding happened. Did he lay out there and then miraculously some ropes started to just wrapping around him, or was it a symbolic binding? We just don't know. Okay, so that's a terrible thing to do, to be teaching somebody and like 90% of your answers are I don't know, but that's where we are. The messianic movement, really the modern messianic movement, got started about 100 years ago and then it really got kicked off with Joel and Johanna Chernoff in the late 50s, early 60s, and that was really a modern time of the messianic movement coming about. Of course, we're getting a little bit afield here, but yeah, even in the early turn of the 20th century, you see a lot of people starting. That's when the MJAA was actually formed under the name of the Hebrew Christians. I think that's what they had that name, and then Joel Chernoff's dad changed that to the Messianic Jewish Alliance of America, getting away from the idea of Hebrew Christians and having that, no, this is a Jewish movement, that we are going back to the Jewish Messiah and so forth. So at any rate, it's fascinating. It's something that I certainly don't know what it means, and hopefully the well, if the people there in that time frame knew what it meant, they didn't pay any attention, because we don't see any change in anyone's behavior at that time. And God said, whether they listen or don't, that's this is what you're supposed to tell them. And so then any rebuttal there, Carl?
Nope.
Nope. Okay.
I'm just saying, no, that there's a whole lot more people that are following Torah since 2009 than there were before. And you're right. I mean, the Messianic movement started well before that, but a whole lot of a lot more started happening right around.
Yeah, it's just amazing. It's amazing how often the people will come into our congregation and they'll tell me, says, I just was reading my Bible, and then it just said felt like the Holy Spirit was telling me to look into go back to the Jewish way of doing things. And I said, well, okay, so how did you come up with the word messianic? And they go, I don't know, it just popped up. And so God is putting stuff in people's minds, and they're looking at it, and the Holy Spirit is giving that to them, that says, yeah, this is what we're supposed to be doing. So yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon. It really is. Throughout the Babylonian captivity, people look at it as being a total loss to the Jewish people, and actually it was not a total loss to the Jewish people. The Babylonian captivity brought in certain changes to the way that the Jews did things that actually strengthened them once they were allowed to go back to Israel. It strengthened them, because they in captivity, they came up with a system of having synagogues in each town, or several synagogues in each town, depending on the size of it. And in that, each one would have a Beit Din, a council or judgment, so that they could adjudicate different questions, both either rabbinical questions of Torah or civil questions within the Jewish community. And then they also set up the house of prayer, Beit Tefillin, where they would have a time of training for people in the local areas where people lived. They didn't have to go to Jerusalem to have any kind of religious training or upbringing or anything like that. That system did not exist prior to the Babylonian captivity. And that's where people like Ezra, Nehemiah, and so forth came up with these plans as to how do we not lose our identity in captivity. And that has served the Jewish people very well, because as they would study Torah locally, and everybody made sure that there were enough Torah scrolls for everyone, to go around in various places that people could study, and it made the Jewish people stronger than they were before, and I think it brought them much closer to the Lord than they were before the Babylonian captivity. And that's maybe one of these days I'll do a real a lesson or two on some of these people that were instrumental in that change, and what that meant for the Jewish population as a whole. Okay, so going ahead, or we'll never get any further here. Take wheat and barley and beans and lentils, millet and rye, and put them in one bowl. You will make bread from them for the number of days that you will lie on your side. For 390 days you will eat it. The food that you will eat will be 20 shekels by a day by weight, and you may eat from it from time to time. You are also to drink water by measure, a sixth of a hin. You may drink it from time to time. Okay, now Ezekiel was also to make sure that he made this stuff, this bread. Now, if you have ever well, and I'll take a picture of it here in a little bit, but he was supposed to make this stuff so that as he's lying on his left side first, he would have this bread to eat and the water to drink. And they said, well, why not the whole 430 days instead of just the 390 days? I don't know. Maybe God was just merciful to him. We see where God was merciful to Ezekiel later on in one of the things that Ezekiel came up with. So the Lord prescribed just what and how much that he should consume each day. And so it turned out to be 20 shekels by weight was only about 8 ounces, 8 to 10 ounces, depending on who's counting. And that's not a half a pound of bread per day is not enough. That's only like 600. I think somebody calculated it's only like 680 calories per day. And that's famine rations, that's starvation rations. Prisoners in jail that are on bread and water get more than that. So his bread was to be a combination of the 6 grains rather than one. And so why was that? Well, that was because they wouldn't have wheat or barley to make bread with in the quantities needed to make bread. And so they would have to substitute other things into the bread and use that as a filler, as it were, so that they would have enough something in the bread to make it bread. It'd be like I've heard of people that didn't have enough, and unscrupulous bakers would put maybe real finely powdered sawdust or something like that in bread to make it to stretch a little bit. So I don't know if any of you have been to well, if you've ever looked at it or tried to buy it, Ezekiel bread, and it's made from the ingredients there. Of course, they've expanded it, make it all sorts of deals, added sesame bread and this and that and the other kind of stuff out of it, call it Ezekiel bread. And but it's similar to eating cardboard. It's to me, that's about what it tastes like, is cardboard. And although I've not eaten a whole lot of cardboard, the Ezekiel bread to me was just not something that I tried it once and I thought, nah, okay, I've tried it once and that's it. So anyway, I think, yeah, okay, here's a picture of it. I'm sure you've seen this in the your bread section someplace or another. And this Food for Life, they've got Ezekiel bread tortillas and Ezekiel bread flatbreads, pita bread and all sorts of stuff. So, and this is what those things, the various grains would have looked like. Okay, so and anyway, that's he was supposed to eat it. Now we don't know if that's the only thing that he had to eat for that whole time, or if I assume that he was to eat this while he was laying down on his side, and as a demonstration, and then the water, because that would have been pretty cruel punishment for Ezekiel, who was a righteous man, to have to do that. So I think maybe it was a demonstration that he was supposed to do that, and maybe not his entire diet consisted of just 8 ounces of this Ezekiel bread and about a pint and 1/3 of water. So that's I mean that's just my take on it, and I have nothing really to go on that. So let's go ahead on verse 12. Eat it as barley cakes, bake it on human dung before their eyes. Then Adonai said, "This is how Bnei Israel will eat their bread, unclean, among the nations where I will scatter them." And then I said, Ezekiel said here, Adonai Elohim, behold, I have never defiled myself from my youth up until now. Have I not eaten what died of itself, or was torn by beasts? Those were some of the requirements for meat, that you didn't mess with that kind of meat. Tainted meat has never come into my mouth. And so Ezekiel's, he was to bake this bread made up of fire, made of human manure, the humanure, the Jews under siege in Jerusalem would have had to do that. And so the food that they did that would represent, it would have been an unclean food, because here they're using manure to fire their bread, the plate where they put the bread on and so forth. Remember, they made pita bread, or a flat bread. It wasn't something that would rise up like your big Wonder Bread things are today. And so they said the prophet had never eaten anything unclean, and so it's kind of interesting that then in the next verse, and let's go ahead now, cooking with cow chips was common, very, very common. It was done, but cooking with human manure was never done. It's we still kind of shy away from anything that's got human waste around it, and so that's this idea of cooking over the human manure, that just emphasized the impurity of Israel. And so there's where Ezekiel, remember when they had the scroll and he ate the scroll without it, saying anything? But this time he's told to take the human manure, human excrement, and after it's dried, then light it off and cook your bread over it. Well, that's just nasty, And so, of course, I just know that cooking with cow chips or buffalo chips or something like that, that's very common all over the world. My grandfather, this is telling how old we are, moved out to West Texas in the 1800s, and I remember him telling me about they would cook in, out there, and they would go round up. He was only like 13 at the time, something like that. And they would go out and round up buffalo chips, because there still were a lot of buffalo out on the high plains of Texas, and buffalo and cow chips. And that's what they would use for their fires each night, because, it's the staked plains of West Texas. There were no trees as such. And so, yeah, they still did that. And he told the story about how they were cooking one day over the fire, and it was very windy. It was typical, kind of like a West Texas wind day, and they the wind had kind of picked up the edge of one of those buffalo chips and kind of just got it rolling. I mean, kind of freaky, but it just kind of picked up that buffalo chips, and it starts rolling, and it rolled right up there to where their campfire was, and plopped right in the pan of beans or whatever it was that they were cooking. And the cook just looked over there, took a fork, and pitched it out and said, "I ain't gonna hurt anybody." And they went ahead and ate it, because that's what they had. And so that's just a little rabbi trail, or cattle trail, actually, about cooking with cow chips. Okay, so now you may remember that one. Okay, Carmen.
Well, that's kind of like why you only use cow manure and horse manure in your garden.
Yep.
You don't use human, because we eat beef, and that brings worms, and you don't put that in your compost.
Yep.
And stuff like that. Anyway, yeah, that's all I had to say.
Yeah, and that's right. I mean, there's a book out there called Humanure, and it's talking about composting toilets, and where when the fertilizer hits the ventilator, and the end of the world as we know it hits, and so forth. And that's what, people, they come up with that stuff, but no, it's just not good practice to do. Okay, so so Ezekiel complained to the Lord, and so then the Lord said, and basically, Ezekiel said, "I've never eaten that kind of stuff before." And the Lord said, "Okay, here, I'll give you some cow dung instead. You don't have to use a human dung. You can use cow dung, but you get the point." And so he said, "So you will prepare your bread on it." Then he said to me, "Son of man, I will break the staff of bread in Jerusalem. They will eat bread by weight in anxiety. They will drink water by measure in horror. On the account of their lack of bread and water, they will be appalled at one another and waste away in their iniquity." Okay, so these, all of that, I think it was kind of cool that Ezekiel complained, and the Lord said, "Okay, use cow manure then. That's okay." And he listened to Ezekiel. So sometimes, if something comes up, don't be afraid to tell the Lord, says, "I really don't want to do that. That doesn't make any sense to me," or "Please don't make me do that." Sometimes the Lord says, "Okay." And I just thought that was kind of cool. Okay, so the staff of bread that he's talking about, that's the food supply chain, that there will be no more food. They're under siege, and the scarcity of food and water, and they're going to look at that bread, and it's like, okay, here's my half a pound of bread. Nobody else is going to get my little half a pound of bread. How much is a half a pound of bread? Probably not bigger than your hand. For especially that Ezekiel bread that's as heavy as a brick. And so you don't have a whole lot of that. And the water, 1 1/3 pints of water per day. Well, you can't hardly survive on that. And so that's why they said they would measure the water by horror. It's just like, that's all I get. And so, but that's what they would have to do if they were going to survive during this siege. So it goes on now. It said, "Son of man, take a sharp sword, use it as a barber's razor to shave your head and your beard. Then take balances to weigh and divide the hair A third you will burn in fire in the midst of the city when the days of the siege are complete. Take a third and strike it with the sword all around the city. Scatter a third to the wind, and I will draw out a sword after them. Take a few from there and tie them in your garment. Again, take some of them, throw them in the midst of the fire, and burn them in the fire. A fire will spread from it to all of the house of Israel. All right, so Ezekiel, he is supposed to take this sword now. All right, now I don't know if any of you have a sword in your house. I've got several. I know it's kind of weird, but I've got several of them, and there's not a single one of them that I would want to sit there and take the sword and try to somehow shave if it was even sharp enough to do so. The swords I've got, one of them is a ceremonial sword, and another couple of Japanese samurai type swords. And so the idea that this is a sword could possibly or probably should have been translated a little bit better, to take a blade, a very sharp blade, and shave your head and shave your beard off. Okay, so that is a sign of when you take and you shave off their hair, their head, and their beard and so forth. That's a sign of grief and humiliation, and so that is part of this whole pantomime that Ezekiel is doing here, cutting the hair, and just bringing out the point that Israel is going to be debased. And so 1/3 of it was burned. Well, that equivocates to the 1/3 of the population being burned and killed in the siege. Okay, and I don't know if the Babylonians had siege engines where they would throw, lob big old fire bombs at them, Molotov cocktail kind of things, like you see in the movies. Don't know if they had that or not, but anyway, they'd be burned up in the city. Then 1/3 of them would die by the sword outside the city, and then 1/3 of them would be carried off into captivity. So 2/3 of the population is going to die. And at this, then he says, take some of this hair and stick it in your clothing, kind of hide it away. And so that tells us that God is always going to have a remnant, even when he punishes Israel to, just to terrible lengths. He always retains a remnant who are going to be saved and who will carry on the chosen people, the Jewish people, and on into the future. So there's always that. But still, he says, take some of that's the remnant, and throw it in the fire. That also tells that, okay, the remnant does not get by scot-free. They're going to also be judged by their behavior. And so, okay, man, we got to go. So thus says Adonai, Thus says Adonai Elohim, this is Jerusalem. I have set her in the midst of the nations with countries all around her. She has rebelled against my ordinances by doing wickedness worse than the nations, and against my decrees worse than the surrounding countries, for they have rejected my ordinances, and as for my decrees, they have not walked in them. So the Lord is telling them, says, okay, just to clear anything up, we're talking about Jerusalem here. So don't get any other ideas that we're talking about New York or something like that. No, he says, we're talking about Jerusalem. And so Ezekiel is now speaking. Okay, the time for muteness is over. He's telling them exactly what the Lord is saying. And so this is the indictment of that the Lord is telling to Jerusalem. He says, look, you were my crown jewel of all of the nations. I picked the people, the Jewish people, the Israelites, the Hebrews. I picked you, and then I made Jerusalem my crown jewel. That's where my temple was. That's where my presence was. And then what happened? Then you rebelled against Torah. You decided you're not going to follow Torah. And then and it says that God says, not only that, you practice wickedness that even the Canaanites didn't do. And so you were more wicked than your surrounding neighbors. And you rejected God's commandments, would not walk in them. So that's where they laid out to the grand jury the indictment against Israel. He said, therefore, thus says Adonai Elohim, because you are more turbulent than the surrounding nations, in that you have not walked in my decrees or followed my ordinances, nor have you observed the ordinances of the surrounding nations. Therefore, thus says Adonai Elohim, behold, I in turn am against you. I will execute judgments among you in the sight of the nations. On account of your abominations, I will do with you that which I have never done, and the like of which I would never do again. Therefore, the fathers will eat the sons in your midst, and the sons will eat their fathers. I will execute judgments on you, and I will scatter the remainder of you to all the winds. All right, that is a terrible judgment. Judgment was coming to Israel. I mean, God says, I'm doing that because you're more of a problem. You act up more than the nations around you. And you didn't walk in any of my, that was one of the things when studying First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles in our history of the Jewish people. It said, and this or that king did not walk in the ways of the Lord. And so they didn't follow the ordinances. They didn't follow the feasts. They didn't do what God told them. It says, you didn't even follow the basic common good sense rules that other nations around you had. You were just completely lawless and did whatever you wanted to. And that's one of the things that we saw in the book of Judges. Every man did what he thought was right in his own eyes. And so God says, now this judgment that's coming on you now is worse than anything I've ever done before. And it's going to be worse than anything I'm ever going to do again. And so that's how mad God was at them right now. He says, Israel, it's going to be so bad, you're going to revert to cannibalism. You're going to eat your own children, or children, you're going to eat your own parents. It's a horrible thing. Then after that, after all of that, you go through all of that stuff and you survive. Well, guess what? You're going to be scattered to the winds. You're going to be put out all over the country. You will not be going home for the most part. Of course, God at the end of the 70 years, he allowed a remnant to come back, and from that, then Israel was built up again. So if anybody's got any comments here, jump in there, because I'm kind of rushing to try to get this done. Therefore, as I live, says Adonai Elohim, surely because you have defiled my sanctuary with all your detestable things, with all your abominations, therefore I will shave you off. I will not spare. I will have no pity. A third of you will die in the plague and will be consumed with the famine in your land. A third will fall by the sword by you. A third will scatter to the wind and draw out a sword after them. I will vent all of my anger and satisfy my fury on them. Then I will rest. So they will know that I, Adonai, have spoken in my zeal when I have satisfied my fury on them. All right, so this is, wow, this is terrible that God is saying, okay, reason I'm doing this, why? Because you defiled the temple. I mean, they did all sorts of things. And so he said that he's going to shave them off. That'd be like shaving their hair and their head and their beard and everything, because they were infested with lice or something like that. That was one of the things that during the Holocaust that they did. They went through there and shaved everybody's head, men and women, everything. They shaved their heads because they said we don't want lice. and but mostly shaving the head of people for the most part is it's shameful, it's embarrassing, and so it's done a lot of times to captives and boots in boot camp. Okay. And so if you've ever been to a boot in boot camp, a recruit in boot camp or something like that, you know what it means to have all your hair shaved off, cut off to about that long. And especially if you grew up back in the 60s and went in the service in the 60s, where it was long hair, hippie, all that kind of stuff, and had long hair, and then all of a sudden you got no hair. Yeah, it's something. So said about a third of them are going to die of the plague, bubonic plague or some other kind of plague, who knows, just a plague. A third will die by the sword, and a third will be just scattered. So this is just a reiteration of what God had already said, what Ezekiel had told the people, and said he is so angry. And a lot of times, Moses would go to the Lord and say, no, just wait a minute. Let's not get so hasty. If you're going to kill these people, well, kill me first. Lord said, all right, okay, I'm calmed down now. And but then he'd get mad again at him, but this time God said, nope, nothing. I am gonna do it. And so that's what he did. And so then we get to, says, moreover, I will make you a ruin and a mockery among the surrounding nations and in the sight of all who pass by. When I executed judgment upon you in anger, rage, and furious chastisement, you will be a mockery and a taunt, a warning and a horror to the surrounding nations. I, Adonai, have spoken it. All right, so what we have here, this is God's objective then in doing all of this, so that he's going to turn them into a laughing stock among the nations, and that everybody is going to look at Israel as, in scorn, actually, just looking at us and, oh, look at that terrible, stuff that is happening to the Jews. And there's not going to be any pity there. They're not going to look and say, oh, the poor Jews. They're looking at what they're having to go through. They're looking at that and says, they're probably saying, serves them right. They're just, and then they'll say, they'll look on it and say, even though they're Jews, that's horrible. It still serves them right, but that's horrible what their God is doing to them. And so that was all planned. That's what God said he was going to do. And so finally, the finish off the scriptures here. And when I send evil arrows of famine upon them for destruction, I will send them to destroy you, and I will intensify the famine on you, and you will break and will break your staff of bread, and I will send on you famine and evil beasts, and they will make you childless. Plague and blood will sweep through you. I will bring the sword upon you. I, Adonai, have spoken. Again, just terrible, terrible judgments. And I think that's why a lot of people don't ever want to teach Ezekiel, because of these terrible judgments. I think I said last week that I spoke to a pastor friend of mine last week, and he says, man, I don't even teach out of Ezekiel. He says, sometimes when I'll just sit down and I'll just open the Bible, says, okay, well, Lord, what do you got to show me today? If it shows up in if I open my Bible and it's Ezekiel, I'll close it up and says, okay, you got something else in mind, Lord? And so he says, man, Ezekiel it just scares him to death. He won't do it. So anyway, this extreme famine is going to result in cannibalism, and God's going to send wild beasts and barrenness. Of course, under those circumstances, women probably wouldn't be able to conceive anyway. Plague and all of the associated maladies that come along with plague. And I've never been seen plague in today's modern world. I've read about it. I've seen other types of things, cholera and typhoid and that sort of thing in third world countries. But there's always associated breakdowns of the human body associated with some of these terrible plagues. And then also with war, he says, I'm going to send the sword after you. And so all of those things. Now, what happened? I want to just point out to that God did not pull any of this stuff out of a hat, and where he says, all right, let me think here about what what I'm doing, and let me make up something. No, he had already told them hundreds of years before that, in 1446. In fact, he told them. So this was 1,000 years before. He had told them in Leviticus. He says, "I will send wild." And these are the curses that if you don't follow God's rules and His Torah, these are the curses. He says, "I will send wild animals among you, which will rob you of your children, destroy your livestock, make you so few in number that your roads will become deserted. When I break your staff of bread, 10 women will bake your bread in one oven, and they will bring back your bread by weight, so that you will eat but not be satisfied." That half pound of bread. And then here's some other ones. Leviticus 26:29. You will eat the flesh of your sons, and you will eat the flesh of your daughters. Again, the cannibalism. Adonai will make the plague cling to you until he has put an end to you from the land that you are going in to possess. And then finally, you will eat the fruit of your womb in the flesh of your sons and daughters. Adonai, your God, has given you in the siege and stress with which your enemies will distress you. The most tender and delicate man among you, his eye will become evil against his brother and his wife and the wife of his bosom and the rest of his children that he has left. He will not give to a single one of them from his children's flesh that he will eat, because nothing else is left for him in the siege and stress with which your enemy will distress you within your town gates. The tender and the delicate woman among you, who never ventured to set the sole of her foot on the ground out of delicateness and tenderness, her eye will become evil against the husband of her bosom and her son and her daughter. Terrible things that they're talking about here. That the cannibalism, where people will be so crazed with hunger and the desire for survival, that they will eat their own children and won't share the meat with anyone else. And so all they're doing is thinking about their own survival, and it's every man for himself. Horrible stuff. So that's on that cheery note, then I will go ahead and close out for tonight.